All right. I was going to have this one be just, okay, here's the setting that we're going to use. All right, bye. You know? And then realized that doing that might ruin the whole point of the actual series of doing this, which is to give you like a step by step. Okay, I want to write a short story. How do I do this? And then you just take that short story and you make it longer, and now you have a long story, you know? So instead of just hopping in and going, all right, here's the thing, I was gonna go, okay, let's build the thing, and then realized there's if someone's hopping in to learn how to build the story, then there's a solid chance they got no clue what they're doing. So instead of just telling you the setting, and instead of going through and building it in front of you, I figured this video was going to be how to build the setting, and the next video would be me building my own setting. Okay, does that make sense? Good. Great. I'm going to focus on two different ways to build a setting, and then one way at the end that doesn't count that much because it still needs the other two. Okay, so the 2.5 ways to build a setting. You have top down, bottom up, and sideways. Great. So top down is, hold on. It's where you start from the macro and go micro. Okay, so you go from big picture to particulars. An example of this would be something along the lines of, the darkness surrounded the star until it went out. The rest of the stars looked on in horror, realizing that the war that they knew no start to, they would probably know no end to as well. So they all collected together, and a few stars volunteered, and the thing that made them stars was sacrificed in order for them to come down and merge together into the world. And from the world rose the Nephilim, the warriors of the stars. And the Nephilim rose from the world and were pushed from it for being so strong. And then the balance of the scales was tipped, and light almost eradicated the darkness. But the deepest of the darkness, the most cunning, figured that it could hide inside the world at the very center. And so it did. And from it emerged the dwarves, the first of the dwarves. So the Nephilim shed their power, their strength, and came back down to the world, so that it would probably be something more like the Nephilim came back down to the world, in the process shedding their strength, so that they could set foot back on the place they had come from. The only remnant left would be their grace and the tips of their ears. And thus the racial war between the tall people and the short people began. Right? So that would be a top-down start. You start from real big picture and slowly work your way down. That's a bit of an extreme top-down start, but top-down start nonetheless. Okay, now bottom-up start would be something... It's difficult to go through a full bottom-up start because top-down you really get the idea of the picture, and bottom-up takes a bit to actually get there, but it gives you more immediately workable pieces. Bottom-up is where you start from the particulars and start to build out from there, right? So it would be something along the lines of, I have a town that I want to start with. Okay, and in this town, I want a blacksmith and I want a bar or pub, right? And the guards from the guard tower really enjoy said bar and pub, or bar/pub and smithery, because the pub gives drinks and the smithery fixes the equipment. So they're very good friends with those two people. Thus, they allow the merchant that routinely supplies the smithery and pub. They are way more cordial to said merchant and tend to let them through with less scrutiny. So the small crime groups, the smuggling groups inside the town are way more incentivized to work with this particular merchant rather than everyone else, all the other merchants. And as you can see, it slowly builds from there. So you just kind of pick a point and it just kind of spreads out from there, layering on top of each other. Great. So top down is big picture to particulars. Bottom up is particulars to big picture, right? If I were to use an analogy of boxes, I would say that the top down is finding the edge of your box and then coloring into the center. And bottom up would be starting from the middle of your box and finding the edges of your box from the center. Great. There's drawbacks and benefits to using both of these. Drawbacks for top down is it takes a ridiculous amount of time to actually go through and do it properly. There's several examples of people just getting lost in their world like that. And a lot of the time, if stories are done right, you tend not to actually give the audience all of that information. A lot of it's wasted, which is fine, you know, some information can be wasted along the way, but it's a lot of information for how much work you put in. The benefit is that it feels very, very fleshed out if you go through and do it right. Drawbacks for bottom up is if you don't do it properly, you just do pure bottom up, they tend to feel very flat, like nothing exists outside of the immediate story, because they slowly build on top of each other, and if you only write about the things that only got built on top of each other, you miss some of the major portions that ground your story, right? But a lot of the benefits are almost everything you make from a bottom up is almost immediately usable. So it's way faster to get there. Now, I recommend a mixed approach where you go through and you start from one of them, doesn't matter which one, whichever you prefer, and then pivot to the other before you actually start writing. and then you will have a world in which you can start writing from that is grounded inside of this big picture. And that gives you probably some of the best results for it. Now, going back to the box analogy, we have building the edges of the box and coloring into it, coloring from the center of the box and finding the edges. And so that's top down and bottom up respectively. Building a story sideways is like, I want to make my box pink. It's it's not necessarily helpful to the actual building process, because you're going to need to use the top down, bottom up, whichever you prefer, and preferably both, to actually start, right? But building something sideways is choosing a gimmick and building everything based around that gimmick. So I'll give you an example of one that I've kind of backburnered to infinity on. I was writing a piece about this setting where what I wanted to do was make it so that it was a Eldritchian horror-esque creatures in the world that are based off of descriptions that sound like bad romance books, right? So you would take a description such as his golden hair shone like the sun, right? And you would take it literally. So people either have to look away from his golden hair or become blind because of it. So playing around with stories, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with that, by the way. I was struggling putting all of it together for those purposes, so I kind of shelved the idea. But you take a gimmick and you build everything around the gimmick. So I took the world with that gimmick and I built that it was like from this Eldritchian, the Big Bang, ironically enough. And it slowly built out from there, where there were these townspeople who were terrified because as soon as the way in which the world was being described shifted, it wasn't like oh yeah, and then the rain started to fall like it was crystals across the midnight sun or whatever, right? I don't think midnight sun makes any sense, but you'd go through and say some nonsense like that, and then everyone gets terrified because those would be the warning signs that an Eldritchian monster is coming, because the environment starts to change and the rain has turned into crystals that are literally falling. I think one of the ones that I took was like the rain cascaded down like gems, casting spells into the room with each reflection, or something similar to that. And so I had minor spells and whatnot getting cast from when a crystalline raindrop passed across some sunbeams into the room, right? And it's like utterly terrifying if you actually break it down and you describe it properly, but I never really did anything with that idea. Anyway, that's a building a story sideways. And you can do it, but it is entirely dependent on how well you use your gimmick. It doesn't necessarily have to be a good gimmick, right? Because what the heck is a good gimmick? It's You just need to know how to use the gimmick. And if you can use the gimmick properly and you utilize the most out of that gimmick, then you can totally do it. But I don't recommend starting with that. It's not a good method. But if you have a gimmick that you're really confident in your ability to use, go for it. Give it a shot. Why not? That's why I added it here. But those are the 2.5 ways to write a setting. And settings are important because it's the world that your character interacts with, So, yeah.